A new UN report says industrialized nations need to spend far more to help developing countries cope with the impacts of climate change. While $21 billion were contributed in 2021, that figure may need to reach almost $390 billion per year by the end of this decade. And that would mean a 20-fold increase. Our next report comes from one community in central Kenya, where adaptation funding is helping people overcome drought and find new means to thrive.
Strong hands, fertile soil and water. A simple starter kit that will help many trees grow. It's part of a project here on the edge of the Kirisia forest in central Kenya that is putting the Samburu community at the heart of protecting their environment and also helping them earn a living.
The tree nurseries have been a real benefit to us. We can earn money, so we can pay school fees for our children. Or we can start up businesses.
Traditionally semi-nomadic, the Samburu people sought out water and grazing land for their goats and cattle, their primary source of income. But dry, drought-prone conditions, made worse due to climate change, forced many to move into the forest. The community first made money chopping down trees and making charcoal instead. It destroyed around a third of the forest, putting both the people at risk and the water relied on across an otherwise arid Samburu region.
We were having to trek 5 kilometers to fetch water.
The Samburu families voluntarily left the forest. Funding from the government and NGOs helped the community adapt to their new reality, driven by global warming, and found an organisation to help protect the forest. As well as earning from seedlings they've planted so far, the community also earns around €30,000 a year from harvesting honey.
We've seen our problems and we say the best way to solve this problem is to move out of the forest, and we take care of our forest so that our forest can take care of us.
Slowly but surely, the flora and fauna are flourishing again, with help from a community learning to cope with change and to build a new future for themselves.
Anti-W Climate reporter Louise Osborne is with me in the studio. Louise, this report, a great initiative, of course, and some positive news with respect to climate change for a change. But the UN says still not enough money is being made available for projects like that. What else does this report say?
Yeah, so when we're talking about adaptation, we are talking about projects like that, but we're also talking about flooding defences, for example, for sea level rises, for these extreme storms that we're seeing that are driven by climate change, also looking at drought-resistant crops, for an example. And the UN says that there just is not enough money made available for that. As you mentioned earlier, in 2021, it was $21 billion. That has to increase by 10 to 18 times by the end of this decade.
How likely is that? I mean, that's a huge increase.
It really is. And, you know, countries are already trying to make available huge amounts of money for adaptation and also to reduce climate change driven, emissions that contribute to climate change. So it is a lot of money, and it is going to be difficult for countries to see that put together.
Now, the money that has been provided, which countries contribute the most aid to developing countries to deal with climate issues?
So it is quite complicated because financing is split between adaptation and mitigation, like I said. $100 billion has been put in place or should have been put in place by 2020. That still hasn't happened. Some of the biggest contributors to that are Germany, France and Japan, for example. But most of the money that they are delivering is in loans, which is hugely controversial because it means obviously the developing countries that are benefiting from that then have to pay back that money. The United States is also a big contributor to climate finance, but the World Resources Institute, for example, found that it was not contributing its fair share given it is the biggest historical emitter of carbon dioxide.
Now, what will be, you reckon, the impact if more money is not made available on the scale that we've seen or that we've described, 20 times more than actually now?
So if this money is not made available, it will mean that these projects of adaptation in developing countries, which are bearing the brunt of the climate impacts that we are seeing, will not be able to make the changes that they need to basically avoid loss of life and huge amounts of damages to infrastructure that comes as a result of, these extreme flooding events and also sea level rises, things like that. So that means that these countries instead will have to have money to help them adjust to the losses that they are seeing. This is something that is being debated at the moment as a separate fund, a loss and damage fund that would help those countries recover. Those loss and damages are going to be much, much higher if the adaptation funding is not available for them. Estimates put it at almost $2 trillion by 2050, which is a huge amount. So actually investing now would help keep that loss and damage limited to a lower degree.
Very briefly, please, in your estimation, how likely is it that these targets will be reached?
Considering the 100 billion fund was supposed to be in place by 2020 and it wasn't, I think it's very unlikely that they will meet the higher ends of the money that the UN is saying would be needed, but they definitely need to look at the lower end, which is about 200 billion per year. We'll have to see whether that's possible or not.
Thank you very much, Louise Osborne, there, our climate reporter.
Last year's UN Climate Change Conference in Egypt delivered a historic breakthrough. After years of wrangling, governments agreed to a loss and damages fund. It was meant to provide financial assistance to the countries most vulnerable and impacted by the effects of climate change. The details, however, were left for later. Now, there are warnings that the plans might be close to falling apart. Preparations are already underway for this year's COP28 climate talks in Dubai in December, but there's still no agreement on what a loss and damages fund would look like, who'd run it, who'd pay what, and who'd benefit from it. Last gasp talks on rescuing the project are now scheduled for later this week. And we can speak now to Rachel Cletus. She is the policy director for the Climate and Energy Program at the nonprofit Union of Concerned Scientists. And I gather that you are very concerned about the Loss and Damages Fund. Welcome to the day. So really, how worrying is this that there doesn't seem to be an agreement on the table about what was seen as a huge breakthrough?
Yes, it's been very concerning, although throughout the year, there has been a group called the Transitional Committee that has been meeting to sketch out the details of how to get this loss and damage fund up and running. Meanwhile, we've seen extraordinarily extreme climate impacts around the world this year. Let's remember it's been a record-setting year, both in terms of heat as well as floods and wildfires. All of those things hitting the poorest people in the world the hardest. And yet this transitional committee ended its last meeting last month in disarray. There was no agreement on details. And so they've pulled together this emergency meeting, which is going to be on the 3rd and 4th of November in Abu Dhabi. And this is a last-ditch effort to pull together recommendations to take to COP28 and hopefully operationalize this fund at COP28. This is an extreme necessity, both for the people on the front lines of this crisis, but it's also really important for trust building and goodwill to secure other outcomes that are needed at this COP.
Yeah.
We still need to bend that emissions curve. So securing an ambitious agreement there too.
Let's pick this apart because negotiators have had a year to hash this out. Who exactly is slamming on the brakes here?
Well, unfortunately, the United States and several developed countries have held a pretty hard line that they want this fund to be located in the World Bank, which just feels really out of touch with what the needs are of frontline communities. The World Bank is a lending institution. It's a donor-driven, richer country-driven institution. It's not set up with its governance or its framework to serve the needs of low and middle-income countries who are facing this dire climate crisis. And they are calling for an independent body with its own democratic governance that's answerable to the COP. Not answerable to the whims of the richer countries. And that was one of the key reasons the last meeting broke down. The other is who has access to the funding and who will pay into the fund. There's an emerging consensus that the money can come from multiple sources, but that richer countries whose heat trapping emissions are responsible for the bulk of the climate crisis right now, that they need to take responsibility and take the lead in providing funding, alongside money from philanthropies, from pollution levies, and also other countries who might be willing to or in a position to contribute. But again, there's just been this effort to minimize and evade responsibility, and that has to shift very quickly. So we are urging the United States in particular to change its posture ahead of this next transitional committee meeting so we can get a breakthrough there.
If we are looking at voluntary contributions here, though, does it make sense at all? Is anybody going to chip in if they're free to choose in what way and if at all?
Well, this is the framework we have. The UNFCCC is not a world government. It does rely on governments stepping up to work in solidarity, to contribute in a fair way. And unfortunately, in terms of climate finance writ large, developed countries are just again and again falling well short. So that is a concern as this fund gets launched. Will it be resourced quickly at the scale that's needed? Because the needs are acute and they're growing in many parts of the world right now.
And what does this back and forth and this bickering over details really also tell us about the commitment of the international community and especially the big polluters and the richer countries? What does it tell us about their commitment to saving the climate and to helping other people or other countries bear the brunt of what they are largely responsible for?
Well, this has always been a collective action challenge, and it's only going to work if each country steps up to do its part. So the United States has a stake here, too. We, too, are feeling the brunt of climate impacts in the United States. We can't solve this problem on our own. And to solve it collectively, we're going to have to show goodwill so that in return, other nations, too, will do their part. Like I said, that emissions curve that keeps going up, that's also increasing loss and damage around the world. So investing in clean energy, accelerating that clean energy transition around the world and funding it, especially for developing countries, that's a responsibility on richer nations. And if they fail to meet it, we will all collectively lose grasp of cherished climate goals. Yeah. So this is a moment to step up beyond parochial interests and come together to get agreement.
Maybe just a yes and no answer. Climate activists have long criticized that COP and the agreements reached there are a farce. Are they right?
No, they're not. This is the only legitimate body where every country, even the smallest small island nation, has a voice. And that's why it's a space worth preserving.
That was Rachel Cletus of the Climate and Energy Program of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.